Hello, everybody. What's going on? It's going to be a good session today. We've got a fun one coming in today. So we're trying something a little bit different today. We're going to do some live training, and specifically, we're going to do some live training on the primary way, the first way that you should be thinking when you're color grading. So we're going to talk about concepts and then application. And I'm going to show you how to apply that thinking once we talk about the concept itself inside of Resolve. So it should be a really fun session. Some of what we're going to talk about today, we've talked about before in different grade schools and different videos here on the channel, but I want to try to tie everything into a single discussion today where we can really focus what it means to think in the best way about what we're doing when we're color grading. Because if you can change the way that you think, you can change the way that you grade, and you can be better at grading like in the snap of a finger. It's one of the easiest ways to level up what you're doing, as opposed to like finding a new technique or a new knob or something like that to twist. Changing the way you think can change the way you grade in probably the fastest way of any possible tweak you might make to your process. So I'm super excited. My buddy Gadali's here with me. What's going on, Gadali?
Oh, hey, how's it going?
What's new, my
You
friend?
know, just had a new short film come out. Got some teaching stuff that I'm prepping for. All sorts of fusion goodness. So
Oh
yeah,
man,
life is good.
doing some fusion ninjutsu?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, guys, so let's dive in. So what am I talking about when I keep referring to the primary way or the best way that we should be thinking about color grading? What I'm talking about is the concept of thinking photographically. And we're going to break down what that means in terms of how we do it in Resolve. But before we dive into that, we need to understand photography and cinematography a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. One of the themes that I'm actually going to return to throughout this conversation today is how beneficial it can be to think like a DP and to shoot like a colorist. If you can start creating connection between those things, if the DP knows where the material is going to land and how it's going to need to be manipulated, that leads to better exposures. And if we as colorists understand how the image is exposed and how we can speak in that language, that of course makes us better at color grading. So that's the big reveal here is we're talking about thinking photographically. And I want to start by talking about some photographic concepts that we need to understand before we can dive into Resolve and make sense of things within there. So here's the first thing that we need to understand. Pop quiz, something for you to think about. I won't be able to stop to take answers in the chat today, but something that I want you to think about is out in the real world. Most of us are probably familiar with color spaces, right? Or with the components of a color space, which would be the tone curve and the color gamut, or what's sometimes called the color space or the color primaries. But really those two things are what form a color space in the traditional sense. So area wide gamut 3, log C3. Wide gamut 3 is the color gamut of the primary set. Log C3 is the gamma curve or the tone curve, right? So understanding those concepts and being probably somewhat familiar with them inside of Resolve within color management. Pop quiz. Out in the real world, before cameras are involved, before eyes are involved, before anything is involved but physical reality itself, what's the tone curve? What's the baseline, like light response out in the real world? Think about it for just a second. Some of y'all might know this one. Some of you guys might not know it. That's linear. We've been talking about linear a lot here on the channel, and we're going to continue to, but that is one of the key attributes of a linear tone curve that make it so vital for us is that that's the native language of light. Out in the real world, everything happens in a linear domain. That's why it's called linear, because it just moves up and down the scale. If I double the amount of light in this room, I have doubled the amount of light in this room. And if I had an instrument which was measuring in linear light, it would perceive double the measurement that it took prior to me doubling that amount of light. This is so simple that it sounds dumb, and it probably sounds silly for me to even be explaining this to you, but it's actually a really important ground truth concept to keep in mind as we start getting to the more complex response of the human eye and of our cameras and of our displays. Okay, so number one, linear light is the domain of photography in the sense that photography, exposure, cinematography is about lighting and staging a scene out in the real world in the realm of linear light. Okay, that concept is going to echo back a couple times in this conversation today. That's number one. Number two, we need to understand some concept of exposure and stops. Now, I don't know what your experience has been with these concepts, but for me, because I went to film school and I understood exposure on a more rigorous formal level during film school, but really once I started getting into color grading, I thought about exposure and was told about exposure and taught exposure in more of kind of a loose, like color grading type of format. Exposure can mean different things to different people, and it can be somewhat subject to interpretation, right? But out in the real world, in the realm of photography, in the realm of cinematography, exposure means something very specific. And in fact, I've already referred to units of exposure just a moment ago. Exposure or stops refer to a doubling or a halving of the amount of light out in the scene. So if I want to if I want to increase my exposure by one stop, like here in this room while I'm talking to a camera right now, right? If I want to double my exposure, if I want to increase my exposure by one stop, I could double the linear intensity of the light that's hitting me over here. I could open up my camera lens by one stop. I could, in a less desirable way, I could boost my ISO by one stop. That would indeed boost my exposure by one stop, okay? So those are photographic implementations of the idea of exposure. Every single time we want to open or close a stop or increase or decrease one stop, that refers to a linear doubling or halving of the amount of light in the real world. Now, here's something that's really important to understand about this that we're going to talk about and return to when we get into Resolve in just a minute here. The only place that we can do that accurately, one-to-one to the physical reality of, again, opening up the stop of our lens is in a linear domain. That's why there's such benefit to doing certain things in linear when we're mastering our motion images, okay? So exposure and stops in the sense of cinematography and photography and a rigid, specific definition of those concepts must happen in linear light. It cannot happen in log, it cannot happen in gamma. You can get close to it, but you can't get one-to-one to it. So if we want to be accurate, we need to be working in linear. That's really important to understand. Here's another really important thing to understand. Lighting and ratio. Now, I am not an expert in cinematography whatsoever. If I could have stood to be outside of the house more often than I can, then I would have tried to be a cinematographer. But I can tell you about the basics of exposure and ratio, which is like of lighting and ratio. So again, I'm going to use the set that I'm standing on, if you want to call it that, to talk to you guys right now as my example. I have a key light over here, right? And I'm actually going to tab over so I can look at my feed, and I want to show you guys some stuff. So I have my key light here. This key light can be really, really bright. It can be really, really dark, and there's going to be a certain ratio. This is the only light in my room right now, other than I've got like some ambient lights or like on the ceiling of this room as well, like some soft LEDs. If I make this light brighter, I'm not just going to be increasing the exposure on my face, I'm going to be increasing the contrast ratio, because now the ratio of the light directly hitting the key side of my face to all of the other light that is kind of incidentally filling in my face and like me in front of the camera in general, that ratio will be higher. This will be brighter than all of the ambient light in this room by some factor, whatever I increase it by, right? So that's one way of controlling ratio, is we can make our key light brighter or darker, right? The other way that we can control ratio is by doing something like this. This is a silly example, but I thought it would be helpful for you guys just to get some simple visuals. I'm going to use an iPad here as my fill light. You guys see that? I'll try to kind of put it out of the frame so it's less noticeable. So here's no fill light. There's my fill light. You can see I'm kind of shaking it up to catch my fill side. What am I doing here? Am I lowering or increasing my ratio? I'm lowering it, right? Ratio between here and here is now lower. Maybe not by much, because the iPad can't put up a great fight against the actual light that I've got over here, but the idea still stands. That's what's sometimes called fill light, right? So that's one way of controlling ratio. And as you can see, this stuff happens in 3D, because I could put that light here, I could put it back here, I could change the position of this light, I could bring it up, bring it down, bring it more frontal, bring it more sidey. So it's a three-dimensional thing. And we don't have to be experts in navigating those three dimensions. I think that is one of the core sort of like magic tricks of really good cinematography, but we do need to understand what's at play and how what cinematographers are doing in order to achieve their exposures. Similar or maybe kind of opposite example to a fill light like we were just looking at would be some negative fill. Have you guys ever heard this concept? Anybody not clear on what that concept means? I actually wasn't for a long while. Here's some negative fill. This is just a flag that I'm bringing up, and it is absorbing more of this light that's skipping across my face and allowing it less of it to bounce back onto my fill side than the gray wall that's off to my left. So negative fill, no negative fill. So what's happening to my contrast ratio here? Contrast ratio is going up, right? Okay, that's like our crash course in basic cinematography, photography concepts, and this connects right up to what we do in color grading if we are thinking photographically and if we allow it to. It's also possible to completely operate blindly and ignorant of these things and to dismiss these things and to think like we're working in some whole new domain when we color grade. That's the way that I learned, and boy, is it a dumb way to get the best possible image, to get the most cinematic image. That's the other thing that comes up for me in this conversation is if we want to actually get an image that is truly, inarguably cinematic, by my way of thinking, one way to do that is to grade like a cinematographer. I mentioned that concept earlier, right? Grade like a shooter, shoot like a grader. So one undeniable way to get a more cinematic, quote unquote, grade in a quite literal sense is to think more in terms of cinematography, to grade like a cinematographer, to grade photographically in addition to thinking photographically, okay? So let's see what else I want to talk to you guys about here. So that's our exposure and stops as well as our lighting and ratio. These are the basics that I want you guys to understand about the way the image that you are manipulating is gathered. You might be a shooter yourself, you might be grading material that someone else shot, but these are like the crash course ideas that I think are critical to understand if we're gonna have any chance at thinking and grading photographically inside of Resolve, okay? All right, let's dive into Resolve and talk about what we can do within here. And I'm just gonna check and see if we have any questions so far from you guys that I feel like we could touch on before we move on. No, we're good for now. Okay, so here inside of Resolve, let me get this visible for y'all. Get this bottle cap out of y'all's way. I don't think anybody needs to see that. And while I'm at it, I'll take a little sip. Okay. So, here inside of Resolve, how can we transpose these same ideas into color grading? How can we just keep this theme going of thinking about linear light, thinking about exposure, thinking about stops, thinking about ratio, and thinking about quality or shape or dimension of light, like I talked about before. Because even though now, like, this is an image that I don't have direct access to the depth data of, it's a two-dimensional thing, that doesn't mean I have to think about it that way. This is a great example of where our thinking can drive our behavior. Just because the image is two-dimensional, if I'm able to think of the image itself as three-dimensional, again, sounds silly. We all know when we're looking at a two-dimensional image that it represents three dimensions and we perceive that third dimension without issue. But if we can perceive and think about that third dimension while we are grading the image, that's a huge upgrade to our process. And that's a different thing than just perceiving an image which indeed has depth, okay? So let's take a look at the ground basics of how I would approach grading photographically now that I understand how to think a little bit more photographically. When I look at any image, let's just find and this one's decent. I always like to use this one as kind of my example here. When I look at any image, this is just baked into my thought process. When color grading, I'm immediately assessing the things that we just got finished talking about. First of all, I'm looking at exposure. Is it hot? Is it under? Is it looking good? Does it look like I would like to move it in some other direction? I'm looking at the exposure. I'm looking at the ratio of the image as well. So I'm thinking about, like, what is the ratio of key to fill? How does that feel? And the third thing that I'm looking at that happens in camera as well, that we could have emphasized a moment ago too, is the color balance. So how do we relate color balance and color grading to the way that the image is captured in the cinematography or the production phase? It's very easy. We rate the sensitivity of our camera to match the emission or the character of the lighting units that we're using. Or we intentionally mismatch those two things. That's how we get an image like this one. The lights used in this scene do not at all match the color temperature that this camera was rated for, right? But if we assume for the moment that we're trying to match those things and get some kind of like a neutral key, like we're seeing here, then it would look something like this. And so here's what we can do if we're talking about the first task of color grading really being to come in and support those fundamentals and idealize them using as close to the same tool set and concepts and manipulations as would have happened on set as we possibly can. This is such a hack, such a great trick for color grading, because if you can do this, you can work invisibly, you can work quickly, you can work simply, you can work intuitively, and if you are working with others, you don't have to ask them to learn to speak some strange new language of like, well, let me explain to you what lift does or what gamma does or what gain does. And I'll just give you guys this quick, aside here on this topic. I've worked with so many clients in my career who have sat in color sessions and have had to learn what gamma means, what gain means, what lift means, whatever it may be. The challenge for me is actually less, I very rarely have clients and very seldom have had clients who come in and are like, oh, I don't know what lift, gamma, and gain are. I can't speak that language. I don't understand what it means. Far more common, I've had clients who come in and don't understand truly what those things mean. They know just enough to be dangerous. They know they're supposed to talk to me, or they think they're supposed to talk to me in those terms, but they're using those terms incorrectly. They're not able to use those terms to articulate what they're after. And we have far better success, even if the client feels that they understand the tools of color correction. We have far better success once I let them know, hey, you know what? You can actually just, great, you can just talk to me the way that you would have talked to your cinematographer. Or if you are the cinematographer, talk to me in terms of what you would have wanted to do with the light when you were doing it on set, when you were shaping it on set. It's much easier, leads to much quicker, much better outcomes in the process. But if we take a look at this, I'm going to build out a couple of template nodes here. So we're going to do our exposure, and we're going to go kind of old school for a minute here. These are not necessarily the exact nodes that I would use in my template node tree today, but we're going to break things out into separate pieces for the sake of discussion. So exposure, number one. Exposure is something that, as I mentioned before, that has to happen in linear light. There is really no alternative if our goal is to get accurate photometric exposure. And I believe that this is an absolutely vital ingredient in any color grade, is the ability to say, hey, expose up by 1/3 of a stop, specifically by 1/3 of a stop, not generally by 1/3 of a stop. An example of generally by 1/3 of a stop, I'm grading color managed right now, and I've got my color management all set up, so I'm working in log. So an example of a generalized exposure adjustment, the one that's probably the most common for a lot of color graders, is I'm just going to turn my offset here in my primaries. I'm just going to open that up. That is a generalized concept of exposure, but that is not one-to-one with actual exposure. We did a recent video here on the channel where I showed that and showed the difference that you get between those two things. We don't want a generalized concept of exposure. We want the exact concept of exposure. We have two options for this, okay? First option I'm going to show you is this. We're going to move into linear. Remember, we talked about linear light a little while ago. I'm going to right-click on this node, go to Gamma Linear, and I can now use my gain wheel to get exact photometric exposure. And even if I want to work in units of stops, I just have to apply the right math. One stop, if we want to express it in geeky math terms, like specific geeky math of what I was sharing earlier about the way stops work as follows. You take your input and you multiply it by 2 to the power of number of stops which you wish to increase the shot by. So if I want to increase this shot by 2 stops, I'm going to multiply it by 2 to the power of 2, which would be 4, right? So if I turn this gain to a 4, which will take me a minute, I have increased my exposure by 2 stops, quite photometrically, quite accurately, quite photographically, right? This is not sufficient. It's not the only thing that we need to do tonally with our image, but it is often the foundation. It's usually the place we need to start to get things feeling really good, to address any adjustments that a cinematographer we're working with might want to see. We have to have this tool in our arsenal that doesn't immediately start demanding compensations. And just to make the demo here live while we're all together, let me find an image where this is going to be a little bit more easy to see. And I'm going to grab my still here. And what we're going to do is reset this like so. And I'm now going to just wipe kind of half screen here and use my offset to try to get to a similar level. So something like that. You can see that there is no way to get the same exact thing. My shadows by the time I'm getting subject exposed into the proper place, my shadows aren't quite responding in the same way. It's actually pretty close in this image, but you can take my word for it. It is not the same. The response is different between these two. So we want to be accurate. This is something that like we're going to do. We're going to make some kind of exposure adjustment on almost every single shot that we touch. So if we can upgrade from log offset to linear gain and get a 2% increase in accuracy and speed, that's a huge net gain over the course of a year of color grading or a month of color grading. Okay, so that's exposure, which I would do in one of two ways. We just looked at the first way, which would be linear gain. Okay, the other alternative that you can use, maybe even easier than linear gain. This is actually what I've been doing most often these days. I'm going to once again reset this, and I'm going to go to my HDR palette. For exposure, if I want to adjust my exposure in an equally accurate way, I can just open things up with my global wheel here inside of the HDR palette. This is photometric exposure. This is happening in linear. And bonus, this exposure is actually in units of stops already. So if I wipe these, other than a small color difference, which is due to something that I did over here, let's actually check this out. I bumped into this issue this past week with a video that I demoed. My Lume Mix should be defaulted to 0, and it is not. So I'm going to set that like so. And now we can reset this again and go back to HDR, and I can talk about Lume Mix in a minute in more detail if you guys want. But if we now go and we boost up our exposure like so, we've got dead equal, identical images because the HDR palette is adjusting the image in linear light, okay? This is true for exposure. This is not true for balance, which we're going to find out in just a moment here, but it is true for exposure. So one thing that you can do is set your exposure with your HDR palette. This is the only adjustment that I like to make with the HDR palette, but we're going to find out in just a second that not everything is as cut and dry as an exposure adjustment. There are other areas where you can make your own choices about how you want to shape your image with the concepts of photography and cinematography in mind. But for exposure, for me, very cut and dry. You want your first attack, you want your first maneuver to be a photometric exact exposure adjustment, okay? First step in thinking photographically. Number two, we're gonna talk about ratio. Remember how we were just looking at this, how like sometimes we can think about exposure in a certain way, but really, or we can think we might need an exposure adjustment, but exposure and ratio are highly interrelated. So I might look at, you know, like, I don't know, let's find a good practical example of this. I'm going to say, here, this is a good example. I might look at this image and be like, oh, it's kind of under. Like it feels a little bit underexposed, right? And I might go to expose it up. Or I could look at this and say, well, it's actually not under. I like the quality and the level that I'm seeing here on the key side. We're just feeling a little bit too harsh in terms of ratio. Ratio of key light to fill light is too high. So that's where a ratio adjustment would come into place. Now, as I said, exposure, that's really only got one correct answer. That needs to be linear stops of light that we are adjusting up or down. Ratio, there's actually a lot of different ways to adjust ratio because all we're doing with ratio is we are less trying to physically recreate the exact things that would have happened if you had, for example, brought in a fill light on set or dropped key light down and opened iris up to lower ratio. We're not trying to exactly reproduce those things because we can't when we're color grading. What we're trying to do is model them in a smooth and broad and organic feeling way. And there's lots of different ways that we can do that, right? One way that we could do that would be to work our good old-fashioned primaries and just say, okay, I'm going to open my lift or my gamma way up and just kind of try to shape the low end of the image, like so. Something like that. I have indeed lowered my ratio between key and fill by doing this. That's not the only option though. There's lots of other things that we could do. Here's another one. This is going to be similar but distinct. We could do our contrast pivot here. Go negative with my contrast. And ideally, set my pivot to around 0.336, which is the mid-gray of my working space. That's going to give me a different type of ratio reduction. Maybe one that I like better, maybe one that I like worse. It's just different, okay? So that would be another. Here's another one that we can do. This is maybe my favorite method, even though it takes a hair longer. I'm gonna go to my utilities here, And I'm going to grab a patch of DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray, which I've saved as a power grade using my exposure chart set thusly. This is the free download that you can grab from the link in the description for this video. And all I've done is set my total steps to 1 and turn off show ramp, and everything else is at its default with DaVinci Intermediate selected as my tone curve because that's my working space right now. And if I do this, I can go back over to my ratio and I can use my custom curves. And all I'm going to do is tap my eyedropper on this gray patch. I can now delete this DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray, and I can do, this is closer to modeling actual fill light. I'm saying pan exposure, and underneath, fill everything in, like so, okay? I can do this while pinning my bottom point, or I can gently pick up my bottom point. These are all just different ways of shaping the low end of the image, and there are worse ways to do this. There are ways that I would not go about this, namely methods that are too narrow. So for example, I would not want to make a ratio adjustment using the low end of my HDR palette, like the dark of my HDR palette, simply because I feel like it is too narrow. The zone that it is affecting is too small, and therefore it's not broad enough, and therefore it's easy to make adjustments that don't feel organic and naturalistic. So there's some tools that will be better than others. Really, your selection criteria should be broadness of the tool. You want it to be broad as opposed to narrow, as broad as you can possibly get without having too much effect on unwanted areas. But within that, it's really all about applying the concept to the tool that you've chosen, okay? So I could do it with my lift and my gamma. I could do it with my contrast and my pivot. I could do it with my custom curves, as I often like to do when I'm grading and I'm really trying to shape, especially the low end, because our eyes are so sensitive to it. So lots of different ways to go about it. The number one thing is to understand the concepts that we talked about at the beginning of this video, where we're looking at whether we're using negative fill or positive fill, whether we are increasing our key light, decreasing our key light, increasing the ambient light, decreasing the ambient light, changing position of lights, all these kind of things that we can think of and try to approximate an analog for when we're color grading. This is really, really helpful stuff to sort of shape and guide our process. So for me, probably the favorite would be the custom curves. And I'm going to show you a trick that I really like to use in tandem with this. You can kind of see, like, as I'm doing this, both in the image and a little bit in the vector scope, mostly just in the image, it feels like we're losing a little bit of color, right? Like we're kind of like losing a little bit of colorfulness or saturation in this image. One way that we could remedy this would be to right-click this node and set my composite mode to color, or excuse me, to luminosity, like so. So now I'm going to retain that color compared to what I had before. Let's actually do this the opposite. So we were here. I'll grab that still, and we're now here. So you can see, here is the normal composite mode. Here's the color, or the luminosity composite mode. This is great, especially for reducing contrast. You can do it either way, but especially when you're reducing contrast, it can be a nice way of hanging on to color that, again, makes it feel more like what it would feel like if you were making this sort of adjustment on set by, say, adding some fill light in here, or increasing the ambience in this car, or decreasing the key light and opening up exposure, as I mentioned before. These are all things that we might get this type of net effect out of in terms of our color grade, okay? So that's how we can think about ratio. Exposure and ratio are highly interrelated, but in my mind, ideally, the way to think about these things and the way to apply these concepts, more importantly, is to start, number one, with accurate exposure, accurate photometric exposure, as I said. Number two, whatever adjustment you're choosing to make your ratio adjustments with, ideally, it would not move your exposure, right? Because if you have a ratio adjustment that does not move exposure, that means that even though exposure and ratio are highly interrelated, you can sort of tackle them as distinct parts of the same process without needing to worry about, like, well, my exposure did look good, but then I made a ratio adjustment that's actually net moving my exposure down a little bit, so now I need to tap back over to that exposure adjustment and open things up a little bit more. If we can have these things as discrete, non-interactive parts of the process, it makes it easier. Even though exposure and ratio are highly interconnected, it's very helpful in our process to have them be discrete processes that don't over-interact. Over-interact, that's quite a term. So that's our ratio side of things, okay? Now, let's talk about balance for a second. So balance is something that, again, if I'm thinking in the sense of adjusting what hit the camera sensor, there's different reasons we might want to shape the warmth or coolness or greenness or pinkness of our image. All kinds of reasons, right? Creative reasons, matching reasons, aesthetic reasons, whatever. But the baseline thing that we want to be able to do, it's kind of like exposure. We want to have a baseline, accurate, neutral way of adjusting the balance of our image. Similar to exposure, the only way to do this, the only way to model, say, when we think about the way that this camera was shot, we can, again, kind of log this under our notes on the way that images are formed, or the way that images are gathered, I should say. Add this to your notes in this section. All modern camera sensors have different photo sites. They have red, green, and blue photo sites that capture intensities of red, green, and blue at all different areas of the incoming image, right? They've got these buckets, these photosensitive buckets for red, green, and blue that are configured in a grid. If we think about what am I trying to accomplish when I balance my image, let's go back to this one, which we mentioned earlier briefly, which is like quite severely and quite intentionally unbalanced. And let's just say, I'm going to reset everything that we've got here on this exposure node for now. Let's say we want to get back neutral for whatever reason. We just want to get back to true neutral. That's something that comes up all the time in color grading, even if that's not the only thing you want to do, or even if that's something that you just want to see on your way to what you are doing. It's something we often want when we're color grading. So we want to have a quick and reliable and consistent way of doing that when we're grading. So how would we do that? This comes back again to kind of what we were talking about with the exposure. It turns out that is actually not really a multiple choice thing. That needs to happen in linear. So check this out. I'm going to move my balance to linear. I'm going to remember to set my loom mix to 0, which it really should be. And in fact, I'm going to go back into my project settings and re-enable that. You can do this right here. Luminance mixer defaults to 0. I like to have this checked. It somehow got unchecked in my project settings at some point. So I'm going to leave that checked. And now what we can do is I can simply adjust my color balance like so. Let me make sure that I have set that gamma to linear. I also just want to double check that my project settings are in the right place. There we go. So I can now move my, it's my offset that I was adjusting. That's why it's not looking like I was expecting. So now I'm working my gain. And I can very cleanly make even big adjustments to my image and have equal, even response across shadows, midtones, and highlights, okay? So maybe something like that is closer to essentially matching the response of the camera to the color or the character of the light that's being used, right? That's a really clean balancing operation that, like, just for the sake of example, let's try doing it with offset now. I'm going to pull up like a half wipe of this and just try to eyeball it to a similar place. Let's see here. Yeah, the long story short here is if we look at the two of them, our offset does not have the same distribution. See, check this out. I've actually gotten a contrast change with my offset adjustment that I don't see here in my linear version. So it is close, but not the same as. And when we're trying to balance things out, we don't want to make an adjustment that requires any further compensation. We just want to have a ground truth, neutral, or a foundation of neutral adjustment in terms of color balance. Is this the only thing that we'll need to do? In some cases, do we want to pump color just into the low end or just into the high end? Maybe, sometimes, but very often along the path, something that we do often want to do is just get back neutral or get back to balanced in a way that we know is even and well distributed across shadows, midtones, and highlights. That's what we use. That's why we use linear for it, okay? So I'm using linear gain to do this, as I just showed here in my primaries. Now, we talked earlier about the HDR palette and about how for exposure, instead of using linear gain, I can just use the HDR palette. That is not the same thing when I'm doing balance. The moment I start moving this trackball for my global around within my HDR palette, I'm doing something different than moving the trackball for gain around with a node set to linear, because the HDR palette has its own internal color primary set. So in addition to linearizing the image, it moves the image into its own internal color primary set. My preference is to keep things in the same primary set. I don't see a reason to move into an additional primary set, and to simply use my working space, or if you're grading in camera space still, use your camera primary set to remap amounts of red, green, and blue. Okay? So a bit differently from the exposure side, we don't want to use our HDR palette. We want to just stick with doing our balance using linear gain. So the kind of roadmap here for thinking photographically, again, accurate exposure using either linear gain in your primaries or global wheel in your HDR palette. Ratio using your choice of contrast tool with preference to a tool that can pin mid-gray or middle exposure, and preference to a tool that does things as broadly and gently as possible, so you're not going to create problematic or unnatural feeling results. And finally, balance, which we want to do with linear gain as well as our baseline. Here's the fun thing, guys. These three nodes, if you can nail these three nodes and nail them not just in terms of the tools that you are using and in terms of filling them out with stuff, but nail them in terms of the way you are thinking about what must happen to the image, this is 80% of the battle right here. I know that sounds crazy, or it might sound crazy to some of you guys, but I swear, this is a huge portion of the battle right here. This is where your image is defined for better or for worse, okay? And it's all done by thinking and by acting in a photographic manner. Now, I want to talk about when that ends. When do we stop thinking photographically? Where do these concepts not apply? Because there are a few. And let me just double check and see if we've got any questions before I move on here. Okay, yeah, so let's just talk about this one real quick. How can you know if the skin is well exposed within the scopes? Like maybe where is 50% gray? This is a great question, and I think one that helps complement our process. I'm trying to give you guys principles, and in some cases what I find to be helpful rules that say, hey, I do it this way every single time. I will never do it any other way unless I prove myself wrong during some sort of exploration in between projects, right? It's really helpful to have those principles, and in some cases those hard boundaries and rules. Only though, where it is helpful to have them, right? We don't want to have them in areas where it's not helpful. A good example of that to me would be, where should my skin tones sit within the vector scope? No rule of thumb whatsoever. I wouldn't even think to apply one. This is what you should use your eyes for. So where do my skin tones sit in this vector scope, or in this waveform rather, or histogram? I mean, I can always look at that. I can go over here and look at downstream of everything. If I window a piece of forehead or a cheek, I can just turn on my highlight mode here and see where that's sitting. Maybe. Let's see, we're still wiping. There we go. I can look at where that's sitting. Now, by the way, don't be fooled. I see this big 50 here on my histogram. That doesn't represent this. That represents this gray field around my subject. I am looking for this much smaller hump, which you can see kind of bumping around. So you can always do this little trick, throw a power window after your output transform, and then just look at where that is metering in your image. But I don't think that's particularly helpful or useful or necessary. I think it's far more helpful, useful, necessary to just get comfortable with exposing your image where you want to see it. So for an image like this, where the creative intent is clearly different than some of the other images that we've looked at today, I might want to, in my HDR, set my exposure super, super moody. And then in my ratio, I might want to do my little fill light trick like we talked about a moment ago with this DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray, like so. And set my anchor here, and then just gently fill this in, like so. I might want to do something like that. It all depends on creative intent, but there's no single rule about where skin tone should live. Ultimately, we want to bring healthy exposures into the image. So this is where, when I'm guiding cinematographer friends, I will tell them, well, you should probably expose your skin tones at a particular level so that they are healthy and cleanly separated from the noise floor, But when it comes time to finally master those images collaboratively, it's all about what we want to see, not about what is correct, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's now talk about where the concept of working photographically ends, or what it doesn't cover. Here's the first thing that I want to point out. I'm already, in a sense, relying on a very non-photographic concept with everything that we've been doing here today. Do you know what that non-photographic concept is? Can anybody tell me? Or think about it to yourself? What I'm doing is I'm using a look. Look has nothing to do with photography. This is a look that I built with my brand new LookDev plugin Contour, which I love and I'm super excited about it. We talked about it recently here on Grade School. We'll have more content coming out about it here on the channel soon. But I'm using this LookDev plugin Contour to impart my look. This look has almost nothing to do with photography. This is about rendering. This is about preferential color remapping. This is much more to do with the way the image appears on the display than the way the image was captured, or manipulating or finessing that captured image. Does that make sense? So where does thinking photographically end? A good shorthand way to think about this is, if you think of your entire process that starts with like your input transform, maybe from camera space into working space, at the other end of that process is your output transform here that's taking you out to your display space. That's one big long line, right? That's one big serialized set of processes. The further you get down that line, the more you will drift from photographic concepts and photographic manipulations, because you're getting closer and closer to your display, and your display and the way it is rendering things is becoming more and more important. So we start with those fundamental building blocks: exposure, ratio, and balance, and then slowly, as we're moving off to the right, we're going to drift out of them. The fun thing is to see how long you can retain a connection to photography and linear light as you go along. So just because these three things are what I showed you or what we're focusing on today, there's lots more that you can do that is photographic in nature. You can apply thinking photographically to your power windows very easily. That's a whole other aspect of this that we could probably do a full grade school session on. You can apply thinking photographically to many other areas of your image, but there's a certain point where you are naturally going to move into things like making a hue rotation. There's really no photographic counterpart for saying, oh, I want to, whatever, warm up my yellows a little bit. That's just a visual preference. That's just something that we want to see. You could say that, oh, I'm art directing the original scene and changing the colors that were used in the original scene. But at a certain point, it starts to become an academic exercise where you're trying to justify what you're doing as photographic when you really don't need to. When you're really about, no, I just think that's a prettier way to render those colors. That's the way film prints work. That's the way that the rendering side of things supports our thinking photographically. Because remember, our first three adjustments are always going to be those purely photographic adjustments, and then they're going to be happening underneath things that are becoming increasingly less purely photographic and more aesthetic. But we've got that nice, strong foundation of working photographically, and that's really where the DNA of your image is defined. The moment that your image is defined, for my money, happens like right here, where I have two basic things in place. I have the end of my pipeline where I'm getting out to display and I'm imparting a preferential creative look along the way. And then I have my photographic adjustments here on the other end, kind of on the front end of it. I've got the chessboard defined at this point. There are things, essentially, all that's going to happen in this grade, like I don't have anything set on this one, but let's just do it. Like, I'm going to set my HDR exposure. I'm always going to touch this even if I feel like there's not anything that needs to change, just because I want to see if going lower or higher nets me anything. Let's go back to my ratio for the sake of speed. Let me reset this. I'm going to go back to my primaries and just look at working my lift and my gain, or my lift and my gamma, I should say. Something like that. All right, and then on my balance here, I'm going to go over here and just nudge this. Make sure this is living in linear. And I'm just going to nudge this a little bit less kind of pinky red, like so. So this right here is the foundation of my grade, okay? Everything that happens from here is going to happen in between these three things and these two things. And those things are just going to fill out or finesse what I've established right here. So that's that 80% mark that I was talking about before. And that kind of gives us the bookend, the other side of the coin to thinking photographically, which is thinking in terms of display, thinking in terms of rendering, and less in terms of the scene and more in terms of the final image. So there is that natural, gentle, gradual transition, but all the more reason to start things in a purely photographic domain. Okay, let's see if we got any questions we want to hit. Oh, I lost my window. Gadali, do we have any questions that we should address?
Yeah, we've got a few questions about using the Lumamix. What's the difference between setting the mixed luminosity versus using only selecting Y in the curves?
Yeah, gotcha. So here's the easiest way to understand the Lumamix. If we look at our image, like any of these images here, and we look at our custom curves, this is going to be the same for our primaries as well as for our custom curves. We've got these 4 channels here. We've got our red, green, and blue, and then we've got our Y, or our lum, as well. Y is formed as a weighted average of these 3 channels. So if you want to see what is the Y channel, what does that actually mean? We can use the channel mixer, the RGB mixer, to get a preview. This is what the Y channel is. You can see the exact ratios. The Y channel says, hey, make me a new channel that's 21% red, 71% green, and 7% blue. These are geeky, what are called coefficients that are derived for a reason, although there's no great technical basis to using them in the way that we tend to when we're color grading, but they're functional. And this is what a Y channel is. So in Resolve, what we're doing anytime we're talking about a Y channel is we're talking about, do we want to operate directly on our red, green, and or blue, or do we want to operate on our derived Y channel, or on some combination of the two? So if we do something like this, let's reset here. Here in our custom curves, let's just ungang, and let's make a big Y adjustment here. You can see right now, nothing's happening. Why? Because my Lumamix is set to 0. And actually, right now, even if I set this to 100, oh, it actually is, maybe this is updated in Resolve 19. Traditionally, I wouldn't even have been able to get a change here because I've got my project settings, my Luminous mixer set thusly in my project settings, but it looks like that's changed, which is great. So when I increase this Lumamix, this is basically saying, how much do you want me to include your adjustments to the Y channel as I'm making adjustments to the red, green, and blue? So at 100, this basically means give just as much priority or weight to what's being done to the Y channel, which is these guys right here. Give just as much priority or weight to what's being done there as to what's being done with red, green, and blue. If you take it down to 50, you would be saying only give half the priority to what's being done here. And by the time you get down to 0, you're saying don't even look at that Y bar. You can swing it wherever in the world you want, and I should see no difference whatsoever. Okay? So that would be the ground truth of the Lumamix, and that's why when we are grading in linear, the specific example we actually saw in this last week's video is we had a little red artifact in the background from a traffic light. I'm wondering, this might not work here, but I'm just curious, if I do an aggressive linear gain adjustment here, can I get a similar effect if my Lumamix is set to 100? And let's just say we're going to do like some kind of big adjustment here. Yeah, you can see it's starting to happen. Like the overall image feels quite warm, but I'm getting like real weird stuff happening up in here. And that's because what's happening on the Y channel is interacting, the mixture of basically when we mix the Y channel back in with the red, green, blue, that's where that's happening. So when we set this to 0, we're back to a normal feeling rendering of those traffic lights, okay? So that's the idea of the Lumamix. It's kind of confusing because you would think Lumamix at 100 means only pay attention to the Y bars, but that's not it. That means pay equal attention to the Y bars or to the Y curves as to the red, green, and blue curves. I generally, as I alluded to before, I like this to be zeroed out. I prefer to have this turned off and instead to have the flexibility of invoking it kind of on a per shot basis, either by increasing that lum mix or by using the luminosity blending mode, which we talked about. This is functionally the same. It just turns out that the coefficients used to calculate the luminosity channel are slightly different than these coefficients that we saw here in the RGB mixer, but they are functionally the same. I think the coefficients are weighted a little bit less heavily in the green, and we've got a little bit more blue contribution, and red is maybe close to the same. I don't remember exactly, but it's slightly different. That luminosity or luminance channel is being formed from slightly different weights of the red, green, and blues than we have natively within Resolve. But other than that, it's pretty functionally similar. What else?
Jim's got a question. Seems like you like linear for the first few nodes on exposure, balance, etc. Why don't you set the gamma with a CST to linear and a CST back rather than changing the nodes?
Oh, that's a good question, Jim. Yeah, so I would say, because I get to use 2 fewer nodes, which I'm always a fan of. It's not a crazy idea whatsoever, especially if you're saying like, well, won't that save you the tedium of having to flip those nodes linear? But you're also right in your first observation that I love to be linear in my first few nodes. So if we look like here in my like native tree, prime, or rather balance, this is already set to linear. For my prime node, which by the way, if we're talking about practical grading now, I grade in this node, I do my exposure and my ratio all in the same place. That's my preference these days. And the way that I do that is I do my exposure with HDR. So I actually don't have to flip linear for that, even though I get to do a linear op. I can do a linear op and a log op within the same node, which is one of the reasons why I use the HDR palette. So I can set my exposure here and then go back to my primaries and work my curves or work my lift and my gamma, whatever I want to adjust my full tonality. And now I'm getting to preview the net of my exposure and tonal adjustments in a single place, which I find really helpful. And then I move on to my balance, which has already been pre-tagged as linear. So that's kind of like the practical application there. But that's a perfectly sensible idea that you could totally implement. It's just say, hey, I've got this kind of first trough or this first area of my node graph that's devoted to linear ops. And so I have everything CST'd into linear right from the IDT or the input transform. And then I only flip into log once I've gone through those first few nodes. It's kind of a cool idea.
Shahid is wondering, is there a way to show stops in curves?
Oh, that's a fun question. Here's the thing, Shahid. If we look at, the short answer is no. There's really not a way to show stops in curves. I will show you the closest thing to that that comes to mind here in my LookDev plugin Contour, where you can draw a contrast curve. None of this stuff is expressed in stops except for white point. White point is expressed as stops above middle gray. So right now my white point is set to 9 stops above middle gray. And I can bring that in wherever I want. That's not something that you can do in curves, mostly because you don't even have access to numerical readouts of what's happening within here. So it's not even like, oh, it's a feature that hasn't been implemented to support linear expression of your points. You don't get any numerical expression of your points within your curves. So no, you're working in much more of just a freehandy type of way in your curves. And by the way, like this is something that comes up as well, like when we're talking about log versus linear a lot. 2 ideas that can maybe kind of sort of wrap us out here. You actually could like go harder on linear than I do. Like you could say as another alternative for your like baseline color grading stuff, you could say, I'm gonna do my exposure and my ratio stuff all in linear. You could do that when you're in linear by saying, I'm gonna work my gain for exposure, and then I'm gonna work my gamma for contrast. Gamma in linear, it's a very good contrast operator. You can even shape your low end by picking up your lift. It's gonna feel very touchy in linear, but you can totally do it. Like I've just rolled in my bottom end, and I'm now adjusting my gamma. And I've now got this whole node that I'm doing in linear to hit my exposure and my ratio adjustments all within here. So that's another option that I kind of forgot to mention earlier that you can totally do. You can commit even more fully to like, hey, everything happens in linear exposure as well as ratio stuff. Or you can do what I'm doing, which is to say like, hey, when I'm doing ratio, there's something that feels more sensible about doing that in a log domain, which more reflects the sensitivity of our eyes and of, yeah, really just of our eyes. And it makes it feel more intuitive. Like if you look at it this way, in linear, your gray point is roughly around here. And then if you're trying to fill in or shape shadows like I often am, even if you're not using the curves, this is the effective area of your signal that you need to finesse when you're working your ratio in linear. To me, that feels a little bit tight, a little bit small, a little bit difficult to make finessed adjustments with. Whereas when we are in log, we've seen it already here today. If we look at my DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray, it's much higher, right? It's like closer to around 35, 40%. So just by virtue of that, I feel like manipulating ratio, especially low end, feels a little more intuitive and easier to finesse in log to me than it does in linear, but you could do it in either domain. And to go back to the original question about stops in your custom curves, no, and I would say like the alternative to that is to commit to more of like a feel-based thing that says, hey, I'm anchored around middle exposure and everything else is just about feel, not about an absolute metric. It's more about conceptually modeling than mathematically modeling what I might otherwise have done on set.
Thomas is wondering, what scenarios do you use offset?
Oh, this is a fun one. 0. I won't say 0. Here's one way that we can use offset. Going back to linear actually you can work offset quite nicely in linear. By the way, lift and offset, they're really, really similar. All that lift is doing differently from offset is it's pinning like your highest values, essentially, whereas offset moves the whole thing. So you could use offset in linear. It's going to feel real weird if you're using it in log, because you can see how it's like fogging or milking the low end. But sometimes that can be totally what you're looking for. So again, you could like, if you were to kind of like put me on a desert island of linear only operations, I would choose, like within my primaries, I would choose either lift gamma gain or gamma gain offset, one of those two. I would use either offset or lift because I can get similar things accomplished with them. But like, here's just grading this with, let's just try doing a full grade using gamma gain offset. So we're going to go linear and let's like, I don't know, let's try this actually on a different shot. Let's try this here. I'm going to paste that setup that I just created, or even better, let's try this. So I'm going to go linear gain up, get my exposure up a little bit. I'm going to go gamma open, soften out my ratio a little bit, and then I'm going to try using my offset to get a little more snap in the low end. So there would once again be a grade done 100% using linear ops, in this case using gamma gain and offset. But to me, offset and lift are almost interchangeable in terms of the way they're going to feel and what they're going to do for you when you're using them in linear. But in log, I just wouldn't do it anymore. I've talked about using offset here on the channel in log all the time. I used it that way for years, but my go-to move when I was working in log using offset was to have one hand. This was actually one of the reasons why I felt the most kind of like addicted to the big control surface, was like my go-to move when adjusting, when using offset as my exposure adjustment in log, is I would have one hand here, and then I would have one hand on my lift to compensate, because I just knew as I open up, I'm going to get more and more foggy in the shadows. I'm going to lose contrast in a way that I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to open exposure. So I'm going to have to start compensating with my lift. So I just got hooked on needing to have access to both of these things at the same time, if that makes sense. Where like, if you're doing this in linear, you don't need to have that compensating sort of like two-handed countermeasure thing, you can just expose. And then if you feel like, well, as I've adjusted that exposure, it is now more obvious to me that I want to soften or reshape my ratio. You can do that without having to wonder if you introduced part of the issue that you now have to go and solve. You're knowing you just revealed an issue that you have to go and solve. That's a subtle distinction, but for me it's really important because if you can get your color grading practice to a place where you are introducing as little need for compensating counter moves as possible, that's going to take all kinds of time off of your working time, because you know you're just doing one thing at a time and it's exactly what you want, and it doesn't have any carrying costs with it or compensations that you then have to make after you've finished that task. Okay, guys, wow, that flew by. This was a fun, interesting format. I would love to hear from you guys as we're wrapping up here today. What did you think of this format? We're thinking we would do this kind of like live training format and try to capture a specific subject in the span of an hour and hit things that we've, like I said, probably hit a good chunk of the things we talked about today in some episode or some video on the channel here at some point. But I was hoping we could kind of gather it all into a single discussion. So I'd love to hear from you guys. What did you think about this? Was this fun? Was this helpful? One of the things that I will mention, thinking photographically is one of several concepts that I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. So if you are interested in more guiding principles like this that can simplify and sort of like shape your path for you when you're working your way through a grade, that book is a great one to pick up. But that's, like, this is, I'm not going to say it's the most important concept from that book, but I can't think of a more important one. I'll put it that way. So I think this was time really well spent. And as I said, once you get into thinking photographically, you understand enough about cinematography that you can truly think in that manner, and then you start working photographically, this is going to increase your efficiency. It's going to increase the quality of your results. It's going to make things more fun. It's going to make it easier whether you are working with a cinematographer or whether you're talking to a cinematographer. It's going to make it easier to bridge that gap between the image that was shot versus the image that's being graded, because you're connecting more to it on the terms of the way it was shot, as opposed to thinking of it as this abstract two-dimensional element that you're just going to throw these abstract tools at and try to get a good result. That's too many degrees of freedom in my opinion, and often leads to waste of time and less desired outcomes. So like I said, let me know if you guys enjoyed this one. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun kind of going through this format, so I hope we'll get to do it again soon. And thanks a bunch for joining me on Grade School Monday. This was a blast. Thanks to Gedalia for co-hosting. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.